Well, hello guys and welcome to this lecture. In this lecture we will talk about the keyframes, and that is basically a tool that allows you to define your own animation. So it basically allows you to go from one CSS to other CSS style and in some kind of animation. So there is like transition, there's no jump but transition between these two styles. And not only two, there can be multiple styles. But I believe that you will understand it better on an example, so let me show you. If I write add keyframes, then some name, so the name of the animation, we will then refer to it inside the element, right? So for example, I will call this one test, and then curly braces. So like this. And in here, we want to define the CSS styles, and we also will define the CSS style for some point of the animation. So for example, at 0% of the animation, I want to change, for example, the width of the element, and I want to change it to 400 pixels, like this. Then at like, for example, 50% of the animation, you can use whatever like number you want. It can be 49 and stuff. You probably get it, right? So I want the width to change once again and be, for example, I don't know, 100 pixels. So it will, at the 50% of the animation, the width of the element will be like 100 pixels. And then at 100% of the animation, I want the width to be 200 pixels. So right now I defined some custom animation, okay? And what the computer will do is go from this style to this style and then to this style. And the percentage, we will then change the percentage and see what happens, okay? So then when I want to use the keyframes animation that I just defined, I write animation, then there will be multiple arguments, so I will talk through them. The first argument is the name. So the name of the keyframes, I call it test, okay? So I'll just write test, and don't worry about this not being highlighted, so it's just basic like white text. Don't worry about it, it will link properly to this keyframes that we defined. Then the second argument is the duration of the animation, okay? So it's just basically how long the animation should take. So for example, 2 seconds. Then the timing function, so I will give it linear so that it is simple. And then a delay, so 0 seconds for now. You can obviously change it. And then you can also define it to be infinite. So if you write in here infinite, this animation will go like loop, okay? It will loop forever. So once it hits this CSS style, it will go back to this one, okay? So to the 0%. It will basically loop forever. But let's get rid of that for now. I will explain this later on, okay? So let's see what happens if I save the file and hover over it. Right, you can see the animation. So it starts, I will just make it much slower, so I will make it 4 seconds. So it starts at 40 pixels and there is no animation because there is like at 0% of the animation, we want this to be at 40 pixels, right? So there is no time to animate this. So if I hover over it, it starts at 40 pixels directly, then it goes slowly to 100 pixels, and then slowly to 200 pixels. And the time it takes to go from the 400 pixels to 100 pixels is the same as the time that it takes to go from 100 pixels to 200 pixels. Because basically these percentage define the amount of time that gets to be spent on the transition between this style and this style, okay? So for example, if I want the transition from this style to this style to be much faster, I can do it simply by changing this property to, for example, 10%. So that means this duration will be divided by 10, so it will be 0.4 seconds, and this is the exact time it takes to go from this CSS to this CSS, okay? Hopefully that makes sense. So basically in here you define the percentage amount of time you spend on like getting from this CSS to this CSS. So let's see how it looks. It goes extremely fast, but it's not a jump, right? It goes extremely fast to the width of 100. So once again, it goes extremely fast, but it's not a jump, okay? So that is basically what you can define in here. And what you can also do is, for example, animate other property. So I can, for example, change the I will make this back to 50%, and for example at like 20% I want a height to be also 400 pixels. Okay, so if I hover over it, let's see what happens. It goes to 400 pixels and then it goes extremely slowly back, because at 0% the default height is 200 pixels, okay? So at the 0% it calculates basically with this height that we defined in the box CSS. But then, so it's basically the same as writing in here height 200 pixels. This basically it's how it is right now. So then it goes at 20% of the time, it goes to 400 pixels, and then it takes 80% of the time, so that means like 3.2 seconds, I believe, and it takes this time to go back to 200 pixels, okay? Hopefully it makes sense. I will just hover over it once again. So you may notice that the height, if you concentrate only on the height, it goes fast and then it goes slow, right? So it goes fast down and then it goes slowly. Okay, and what you can also do is basically add a style. For example, if I want the height to be at 400%, but I want the height to be at 400% even at like, I don't know, 80% of the animation for some reason, okay? So I can definitely do that simply by putting in here a comma and then writing 80%. So that basically means that from 20% to 80%, I want this style to be in here, okay? Hopefully that makes sense. If I hover over it, you should see that the height stays exactly at 400 pixels for some time, okay? It doesn't just touch and go back, but it stays in there. So let's see. And it stays at 400 pixels, right? And then it goes back down. Okay, and then it goes back down. Okay, you should be able to see this, right? And I can do that with multiple elements. So in here I can write also like from 50 to 80%, I want the width to stay at 100%. So it will also be small, and then it goes like, yeah, you see that. So yeah, that is what you can do with keyframes. Keyframes are extremely useful. So another thing that you maybe want to do, maybe like in the future, you want to use multiple keyframes on one element. So if I define in here other keyframe, for example, like test2, you obviously want to write some real name, but for the teaching purposes, test2 is good. But for example, I want the test2 to be transform, and in here I want it to rotate. So in here I will pass 0 degrees like this, and then at 100% I want it to transform but rotate by 360. So what that will do Well, basically, we are going from this style to this style. So in order to get from 0 degrees to 360 degrees, that basically means one turn, we need to go through, like, we basically need to turn the element, right? So we need to do the animation of rotating. And that is great. So what we can do now is, for example, in here, let's get rid of this stuff. So it will not animate on hover, but it will animate automatically. And in here I will just write animation. I could have like keep that, but never mind. And I'll just write it again. So test, it will take, for example, 4 seconds, and it will be linear. And we also will have 0-second delay. And yeah, that's it. That's it. So right now if I write comma, and on the next line, for example, I can write test 2, then 3 seconds and linear, and I can give it, for example, a delay of 3 seconds, and I want this to be infinite, so like this. So what that means? Well, after 3 seconds it starts rotating, right? And it will rotate infinitive to infinitive. So basically it still rotates. It still does this animation. And what this animation does is it rotates the element, because at 0% we want to rotate it to 0 degrees, but at 100% of the animation we want to get to this point. So basically it's like writing at 50% of the animation we want it to be like 180. Okay, so it's just the same as writing this, but for every percent, right? So for 25% it will be like 90 degrees and stuff like that, but computer automatically does that for us, so this is like redundant. But maybe it helps you to understand the keyframes and what is happening. But like, to be honest, you probably need to spend some time on this and try it on your own, right? So if I also add infinite to the test animation, it will both of these animations will be infinite. So it will turn and it will like transform. So you can do all kinds of really extremely fancy stuff. And I will just change this, for example, to 10%, so there is no jump. It will be all smooth, right? So you can do extremely interesting things, and it's like great. We did it like with few lines of code, and you can define any animation you want using these keyframes. So they are extremely useful. You can use them whenever you want, however you want, and I suggest you play with that a bit and see what it can do. You can make a lot of things. So if you have any questions or if something isn't working, feel free to ask, and I will see you next time.